Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at our Quinn Memorial Lecture for the year. My name is Tony Schmader, and since July 1st, I've been the head of the Department of Psychology here at UBC. I'm a professor of social psychology in the department. And it's my great pleasure to have you here on such a beautiful day on this campus for this event. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we're gathered is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, and we thank the Musqueam Nation for their hospitality and support of our work. I'd also like to acknowledge that here in the lower BC mainland, we're often on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and other Coast Salish peoples. For the people joining this event virtually from many places, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. The annual Quinn Memorial Lecture is made possible by a generous gift to our department from our alumnus, Dr. Michael Quinn. This endowment has allowed us to establish several student research awards and travel opportunities. In 1969, Dr. Quinn became the second person at UBC to receive a PhD. He then went on to have a distinguished career as a clinical psychologist at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam, British Columbia. We're honored to have Michael's family with us here today, Agnes Douglas and Wendy Sutherland, his niece and great-niece, respectively. To them, Dr. Quinn is Uncle Mickey. And Agnes was just sharing with me that she's been coming to enjoy this event for many years, except for COVID, and often would have conversations the next day with Michael's younger sister, who lived in Alberta and wasn't able to travel here to recount what the speaker had spoken about. So it's such a nice memory. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today to take part in the learning and the intellectual community that this generous gift has really helped us to provide. And through events like this, Michael's legacy lives on. So I'm now going to invite my colleague, Dr. Joan Nchoko, to introduce our speaker for today. Joan is going to be moderating the Q&A after the talk and taking questions in the room and online, and we'll tell you a little bit about Slido, which we'll be using for the Q&A part of the event. And afterwards, I do invite you to stick around for the reception. You all had a drink ticket in your name tag, and so it'll also be an opportunity to mingle and talk more with our speaker. All right, Joan.
Yes, exactly. And so before I introduce our speaker, I would like to mention that we will be having the Q&A after the talk. And so we will be accepting questions from people both in person and online. And so for those online, to join the conversation, just submit and vote in the questions in Slido using the hashtag, I believe, UBC Quinn is what it's called. And then you also have the signages in the side so that you can do that. I am really excited and honored to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anna Nobre, otherwise known as Kia, and she's an Tsai professor of psychology at Yale University. And I overlapped with Kia really for only a brief period of time back when I was there at Yale, but she quickly became incredibly inspiring to me as a female cognitive scientist and leader of the field. And I think if I could give one word to describe Kia, I think it is that Kia is a challenger. I think she's a challenger in both her research as well as in what she does outside of the lab. And to situate this a little bit more, I think Kia built one of her research programs, I think, during a time when a lot of the people in my field of cognitive psychology was so focused on how is it that we attend to objects objects in space. Part of it was because it was easy, like objects are static, they don't move. But Kia then pushed back and she said, well, but an equally important dimension of our experience is time. We are beings in time. And so she started to ask, how is it that we attend not just to objects in space, but also to moments, however fleeting and dynamic in time? Or when researchers, I think, then started to focus on how we attend to the world outside of us, from objects in space to events in time, Kia pushed back again. And she said, well, what about how we attend not just to the world outside, but also to what's inside our inner world, our goals and our expectations. And she has since then, with her students, developed just incredible methods for tapping into the richness of inner mental life. And I think it's just so inspiring. But when doing this kind of rigorous work, developing all of these different methods and trying to understand the underlying mechanisms of how these things work, it's very easy sometimes to focus on the basic science. And I think there Kia again has pushed back and discovered ways in which cognitive signatures can actually help us identify risk factors, let's say in neurological and psychological disorders such as Parkinson's and schizophrenia, for instance. And I think there again, she has been just amazing in trying to draw these bridges across all of these different areas. And I think that's a part of what she's also trying to do now at Yale as the Associate Director of the Tsai Institute, where she has been integral, I think, to building and trying to establish these interdisciplinary collaborations, not just within psychology anymore, but across disciplines, from philosophy, computer science, to even people at the med school. And so that has also been very inspiring. And so her work then, it's no surprise, it's been widely recognized. And so Kia is a fellow of the British Academy, an international fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, and an international honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has also been the recipient of numerous recognitions, including the Broadbent Prize from the European Society for Cognitive Psychology, the Lifetime Mentor Award from the Association for Psychological Science, and most recently, the Fred Kavli Distinguished Career Contributions Award from the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. And that's just a few, really, of the awards that Kia has been given. But beyond the research, I think what was very clear back then when I met Kia at Yale was how incredible she was just really as a mentor, and just how much she cared for the students and is an incredible, incredible champion for diversity. And I think it's also for that reason that she has been inspiring to me. And so Kia, we're so thrilled to have you here today. It's been a pleasure to bring you around UBC. And so everybody, please join me in welcoming this year's Quinn Colloquium speaker, Dr. Kia Nobre.
Just a minute, I have a little technical glitch here. Okay, we're going to go with a technical glitch. Okay. Joan, thank you so much for that super warm and kind words, and it's an absolute honor to be here on this special day in this stunning university and fantastic department. So thank you guys for giving me your time in this special moment. I'm delighted to share some of our work with you today. The work that I'm going to be talking about is really about some of our more basic, fundamental attempts to understand some of the building blocks of human cognition. Of course, we are beings situated in the world, and the world interacts with us. From it, we perceive and act. I like to think of the perception and action as a loop, very much like the John Dewey kind of approach, and not as separate things, but we, perceive to act and act to perceive. And as we're doing that, the world is impinging on us with stimulation coming in. We process it, we act, but we also store traces left behind at many different timescales in our memories. But this is a very only small part of what's actually going on, and a lot of the processes that I study are actually how the organism goes about trying to anticipate, select, prioritize, and prepare which of the things from the environment and from the mind it should be using in order to guide this perception and action loop. So many colleagues over many years have been studying the functions associated with selective attention, or attention from short. I like to define attention not as a thing or as a state, but as these functions that are anticipating, selecting, prioritizing, and preparing contents to guide adaptive behavior. And most of the research for many decades has really focused on how it is that our goals, which we maintain in short-term or working memories, are actually guiding the process of attention and in interacting with the external world, in enabling us to pick up the right contents that are coming in from the sensory stream. A lot of my work, as Joan mentioned, has been to enrich this concept of attention. So we kind of joined this field and sort of showed how attention is not just directed to features and locations of things, but also to moments in time. And we joined many others to sort of make the point that these kinds of proactive, anticipatory, and selective functions are not just derived from our immediate goals, but that all different kinds of memory traces and our experiences are also kind of aiding us to pick up the relevant signals from the world. So we spent quite a bunch of time in the lab over the years studying how we direct attention to the sensory stream to pick out relevant things in the world. So, we sort of showed how this network of areas that's involved in directing spatial attention is very related to the ocular motor control. We then, we initially did this with, most of you were probably not born yet when we stopped using this method, positron emission tomography. Then we moved on to, the fMRI revolution. We kind of stimulated these areas, showed that it interacted with a pickup of sensory information using TMS. We were able to sort of visualize the brain in this preparatory state, pre-activating. This is interesting. Pre-activating things, is it that? No. Okay. Pre-activating things that it's preparing to select. We showed how this was happening in time, and then we also sort of showed how we can orient our attention based on our long-term memories, which is actually where most of our predictions of what's going to unfold pick up, and how this attention system then interacts with memory systems to guide the pickup of relevant information acting upon sensory systems. So this was our, I would say, minor contribution to a very, very fruitful line of research that goes from understanding human behavior all the way down to the cellular mechanisms in human and animal models. So I would conceptualize all of these kinds of findings as one set of arrows of attention, as what we would nowadays call external attention. But as Joan mentioned, we also became really interested in how do we turn these arrows of attention into the contents of our mental life and our mental experience. So this is basically a drawing. It's not a theory or a model. It's just a schematic and a framework that helps me think about how memory and attention work together in order to guide adaptive behavior. So in this model, attention, as I mentioned, comprises these selective functions, and memory provides the traces, which are the origins for these functions, but they can also serve as a substrate for these functions, and in kind of creating this virtuous cycle between drawing on experience to guide behavior. So in the talk today, I'll talk to you first about some of our work and to how we orient attention into the contents of our working memory. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of our more recent work that is all kind of ongoing. Our lab is very much in flux. So I moved from Oxford to Yale about not quite 2 years ago. So I'll also give you a taste of where we're going, but there'll be a lot of things that are not definitive yet and toward the second half of the talk. Okay, so I want to start with this, how we discovered this ability to focus attention in working memory, and I hope that all of you think that this is the most obvious and boring thing in the world. When we started doing this was very far from something that was thought to be doable, in the sense that we all knew based on the work in the 50s and 60s, that, the working memories are already very sparse. We collect only a few things from the world. It's already the product of attention working on the sensory pickup of the world. And you have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 things in mind, and if you need to find something, you just rummage through them until you get what you need. And we knew that any kind of attempt of using cues or anything to prioritize that was useless because there were no behavioral benefits to using these cues. We thought that was strange. So, it was kind of, in all the textbooks and stuff, post cues work for very brief moments. After about half a second, they don't work anymore. So we just revisited this question and asked this heretical question. It's like, okay, what if we have a very simple task where people are just, this is one version, there were like about 4 studies like this in this original paper. And this was like, if you just see 4 colors and then they go away, and then at the end of the trial, you just have to say, was this color in the array, yes or no? We can present cues beforehand, indicating like, if I'm going to ask you about the color and it's present, it's likely to be in the upper right. So people had done that before. That's a typical orienting spatial attention to the sensory stream. We knew that that would give us advantages. But what we did, which was different, was to let the array go away for at least a good second, so that there was no after image, there was no iconic trace, and then only later gave a cue to indicate which of the items we were likely to ask you about if it was present. It didn't tell you whether it was present or not, it just told you this is the most relevant location in your mind's eye if you're going to perform well in the task. So we ran this study, and maybe by now expectedly, but at the time very surprisingly, we found that compared to situations where we gave 2 neutral cues, either the cues before or the cues after provided enormous advantages behaviorally for people in accuracy and reaction time, and sometimes misleading cues could also provide decrements of performance. So at that time, and this was actually a study that was done by a graduate student at the time, Ivan Griffin, we had so much pushback from these studies, and everybody thought like, oh, this is articulation, I don't know, people are cheating, they're looking at things, and we're like, there's nothing to look at, everything is gone, So I had like fights with people, and so this was both terrifying, but also exhilarating, because in the end, I just told people like, you don't have to believe me, just run this study. These effects are enormous. So it was great because everybody was irate, and so they started trying to debunk the studies. And we now have, a thriving field of retrocuing, as we like to call it. And at that time, we did a bunch of stuff. We did some MR, we did some EEG studies. And with the MR, we showed that the networks that we had shown were involved in orienting attention to spatial locations in the sensory stream were also specifically activated when orienting attention in mind. But in addition, when we oriented attention in mind, we kicked in a few extra players that weren't involved in orienting attention to the sensory stream. And at that time, we made the argument that, like, this makes sense. It's a different canvas. When you're orienting in mind, you already have stuff there. You're able to take those contents, select them, prepare them for action, so you can do more than when you're just in a state of anticipation. So that was the beginning of this story, and as I mentioned, initially the reaction was disbelief from people, and after that, we came from the debunkings to the replications, and then there was a phase where basically people just said, oh, internal attention is just like external attention, but just pointing the other way. One of the things that I hope to show to you today is that that's not quite right. There's a lot of commonalities, but there are many particularities that are also very important in how we orient attention to contents in our minds and memories. Then there was this kind of idea of like, well, what is the mechanism? People were determined to find this one singular mechanism, how this strange cues could actually improve performance, including accuracy. Like, how can you improve your accuracy to something that you've already seen? So people first started saying like, oh, maybe it's because you preserve it from decay, and then studies showed that wasn't the case, because if you had a retro cue even much later than if you would have prompted something early, you would still get benefits. So it wasn't just about preventing decay, it wasn't just about sort of providing access to the response system. So people tried to kind of come up with a one single answer, and we kind of pointed out like, there are many, many ways in which the brain can enhance the information processing. And if you think of externally guided attention, you can increase firing rates and change noise levels and integrate things and route information better. And so it should be also with internal attention. Depending on the task parameters and the demands, you may be able to improve performance in many, many different ways. And finally, one of the really gratifying things is that, only recently, really, people have started actually taking these processes and looking at the real mechanisms at the cellular and circuit level with animal models. So the first part of the talk is kind of giving you a taste for the quirky and unique aspects of internally guided attention. So I just chose a few, favorite representative studies from the lab. So one of the first studies that kind of gave us some interesting clues was actually very similar to Ivan's original study. It was done by George Wallace, who was also a graduate student at the lab, supervised by myself and Mark Stokes. And it was very similar to the study I just told you about. We had an array of 4 things, and in the end, the methods had improved a bit by then. People had to say whether the item that appeared at a given location was rotated clockwise or counterclockwise. And we directed attention to it either before or after the array. And this is just the behavioral data showing that compared to when you have neutral cues, either cues before or cues after give you much better perceptual sensitivity. And actually here, you can see that either pre-cues or retro-cues speed your reaction time in the same way. So actually here, there's actually 2 almost overlapping lines here suggesting the reaction time benefits. In this task, we were then also recording magnetoencephalography, or MEG, and we knew what we should expect from when people were given a pre-cue in spatial attention and they were orienting their attention to the external incoming sensory stream, because people had shown that before, including us, that when you do that, you have a change in some oscillatory markers in the brain that reflect excitability in visual areas. So you have the hallmark sort of change in alpha band response, which goes down contralateral to the location where you're attending in space. And this is what we saw in this task as well. So after the cue, you have this state of alpha, and it remains kind of elevated there, waiting for the array to happen. When we did this with the retro cue, we didn't know what we would find, because, in a way, you could think if you're orienting attention inside, maybe what you want to do is block out the entire sensory stream. You want to just shut things off. Maybe you just rev up alpha on both sides and do something else, go pick up some memories in some other way. Or, based on many of the ideas that even when you represent something in working memory, you're still using a lot of perceptual areas and sensory areas. You might also want to interact with these areas in order to orient attention to the relevant items. And this is what we found. We can see that when you're orienting attention back, nothing's on the screen. These things are just in mind. You see a very similar pattern of changes in visual excitability, prioritizing those same locations, but now in your head, in mind. But importantly, and very interestingly for us, this was not a sustained effect. It happened and it went away. It was like these cues inside the mind says, okay, where's the thing I need? Got it, done, and now it's doing other stuff. It was like a punctate thing. And this, in and of itself, on a tangent, sort of kind of went against one of the standard interpretations of working memory, which is that it is an act of sustained attention to items in mind. So this showed that you can orient attention in and out very flexibly in working memory. It doesn't have to be a sustained thing. And in fact, we did the same study on a very large group of older participants, which had a lot of variability in how much they benefited from these attention cues in working memory. And we showed that the more short-lived the effect, the better their benefits were. So it shows that this is really a dynamic process. Then another study that showed it, so we have this kind of highly dynamic system, and the other thing that we then discovered is that compared to external attention, internal attention is really flexible and reversible. And again, this also goes against a lot of the dogmas in the working memory field. And this is, I think, a beautifully designed study by Freek van Ede, who was a postdoc in the lab. He came as a Marie Curie fellow, and then he also had a Royal Society fellow in the lab. So he's stuck with us for quite a while, and we continued collaborating. We love to work together still. So in this task, participants kept their fixation in the center, and they just viewed these two colored-oriented bars. And then at some point, they were given a prompt, and then when they were given a prompt, it had a color, and their task was to then report the orientation of that bar. So what we made people do is, like, when they got the prompt, we said, okay, you see the prompt, make sure you're ready. When you're ready, click the mouse so we can get a reaction time or decision time measure, and then you're on the clock and you have to reproduce the thing quite quickly. And the manipulation here is that people were probed by one or the other item, more likely depending on what time the probe appeared. So as in this case, for this participant, if they were probed after about 1.5 seconds after the initial array, or 1,250 milliseconds after it had gone away, they were likely to be probed about the yellow one. Yellow and blue, and the orientations were randomized trial by trial. So, but if time passed and nothing happened, there's no beeps, there's no prompts, there's nothing happens, just time passing. And if they were asked later at 2.5 seconds, then they would be asked about the other one. As I said, once they are probed, they take their time, make a decision, click the mouse, and then rotate on the clock to respond. And so the question here is, like, can you focus just by the passage of time? Does the brain extract that temporal structure and use that to prioritize items in your head? And can it do it in a flexible and reversible way? And that's what we found, which, you know, I think was quite remarkable at the time. So we see that if you're probed about the one you're anticipating to be probed early, you're both faster and your errors are smaller. And the other one, if you're unexpectedly probed about them, you're pretty slow and you're worse. But this thing that was slow and worse and badly represented in at the early moment in working memory, as time passes, now it gets prioritized, and now you're much faster and you're much less error prone to respond to it. So unlike in the real situation in external attention, like once you've attended to something, the world's happening, something else happened, you've missed it. In your working memory, there are just a few things, and you can up and down regulate these things flexibly, and your brain does this by extracting the temporal structure from the environment automatically, just as it goes along. And here we were also recording EEG, and we showed just as before, that alpha signature. We showed that the more you had that contralateral alpha signature in a given trial, the faster you were on that trial. So that also showed that this was kind of capturing the prioritization of items in mind. So already now that we see that unlike external attention, internal attention is very dynamic, it's flexible, it's reversible. And the other thing that we've discovered is that it's action ready. So once things are in working memory, you've already taken out, extracted things, all the features, you can integrate them. If there are actions associated with things, those can also be computed. So everything is packaged, we don't know how it's packaged, but everything is there and available for you to use. So in this study, which was also done by Frake, so I'm going to show you like 3, I think, studies done by him. The simple thing that he did in this study is like to bring back modestly action back into the working memory study. So most people in working memory, they study, you know, what's the representation like? How many things can you hold? How well can you hold it? But it's like we've forgotten that working memory is only there because it supposed to guide action, and it's useful for us to do something with it. So Frake, what he did is he tethered different items to different responses. So in order to respond to a stimulus, the prompt always appeared on the vertical bar. So to respond, if it was counterclockwise, you had to use your left hand, and if it was clockwise, you had to use your right hand. And this was a simple task where you just see 2 things, and then you get cued, you respond 1. So the question is, how do we do this? So intuitively, I think most of us would think like, well, if you get probed by the blue one, you think, oh yeah, blue was on the right, it was rotated to the right, so I have to use my right hand. So you'd first do the sensory selection and then do the motor selection. But everything's already there in working memory, so maybe you can just go straight to the motor action and maybe even forget about the sensory location of items. It's no longer important to your task. You never have to actually report location of things, you just have to report the orientation. Or you could select both the sensory and the motor attributes together. So in using EEG, we orthogonalized, which side the item was with and which hand you had to respond to, and we could separate out the sensory selection in the alpha signal that you're already familiar with, and then the motor selection by capitalizing on the motor rhythms in central areas in motor cortex in the beta band. And what we saw is that you can easily get these two different signatures out quite clearly, and that actually both of them just kick off at the same time. So it is the case that, and here's just the graph showing the changes in the alpha and the beta band, and you can see that both sensory and motor actions are co-selected in working memory because everything is there. And you might wonder, like, why select the sensory stuff at all? And maybe in this task, because they had to reproduce something very fine, maybe the sensory attributes were also relevant, and maybe there was a back and forth between sensory and motor. Honestly, we don't know. But this is something that might be very task dependent. And this is just to show that this was true for all of our participants. So another way in which internal attention is bound to actions is also a way in which external attention is bound to action. So external attention is about focusing on things in different locations, and it rides it's evolved from the ability that we have to orient our bodies and our gaze and our eyes to different parts of the world. In internal attention, it's very interesting because there's often nothing in the world that you have to orient to. Everything is just in your head. But we discovered that we also use ocular motor systems to orient attention in mind. So here's another one of Frake's studies. Again, as now you're familiar with, there are two items. You get probed on one, and then you report it in the end. And we always ask people when we do these tasks, like, just whatever you do, keep your eye fixated in the center. We really need you to fixate in the center. Fixation is your friend. If you move your eye, you screw up our experiments. We have to redo the task. So please just look at the center. And people, they look at the center. This is their eye gaze here in the middle. And these are the locations where the items would have been on the screen. So we had done this task, and this was a time when there was a big crisis in the EEG and MEG literature because people were all decoding orientations and trying to decode the orientations that people were seeing. And then people realized, like, oh my God, there's a different pattern of eye movements, and now we don't know if we're decoding the orientation of the stimulus or people's eye movements, and we can't control for people's eye movements really well. So Frake, who's a genius, says, this is wonderful. Let's use this in our task where there's nothing to look at, and let's look at the eye movement. So as I can show you here, people are looking straight ahead at the center, but if you look really carefully under the hood and you compare these two conditions, what you see is that when you're orienting your attention in your mind to things on the left, your eyes twitch a little bit, do these little tiny microsaccades to the left, and if you're looking to the right, they do eye. And so you can trace that. There are very small eye movements that are involuntary that people are making. You can see that they differ when you're orienting to the right or to the left, and you can calculate these kind of what we call the towardness index by just comparing it. And this now provides us a metric of where you're focusing on in mind by looking at your eyeballs, which is quite fun and amazing, and you can do this in a dynamic in real time. So Frake has been doing loads of really interesting studies using these microsaccade measures to try to understand the nature of internal attention. So I'll just give you an example of something that we've done together, but he's gone on to do some really, really beautiful work. So we realized in these tasks that we were running, there were two things that are happening. We had these cues, which were orienting people's attention to one item or the other, but the cues themselves also had a color which matched one item or the other. So it could be that by presenting a pink thing that it automatically captures pinkness in your mind. So there could be an involuntary shift to pink independently of whether that's informative to you or not, or whether you're voluntarily shifting attention. So we basically did this task where we had different conditions where the color of the cue meant that was the relevant item that you had to select, or the color of the cue meant you had to select the other item, or the color of the cue told you nothing at all. And we sort of charted by people's eyeballs how attention was shifting based on these automatic or voluntary functions. So what we would intuit based on our external attention literature is that automatic shifts of attention are much faster, They are less long-lasting. They come and go. They can, happen within a couple hundred milliseconds. But it takes a bit longer to develop these voluntary shifts of attention, and they last longer. What we found was something totally different. We found that both automatic and voluntary shifts of attention start together at the same time. They co-occur. So there are multiple attentional prioritization functions running on your internal representations at the same time based on the feature, like the automatic feature capture and on voluntary attention. So again, this shows how when attention operates in this different internal canvas, it's able to do things in a different way. So hopefully that gave you some ideas of how internal attention, yes, it's related to external attention, but there are a lot of important differences just by the fact of how the canvas on which it's operating and the properties of those representations. Okay, so in this part of the story, then we talked about these internal attention. Hopefully I convinced you that internal attention is a thing, it's quite flexible, reversible, and it also helps us to think of working memory itself, not as this representational slate, but as a really important fuel for guiding adaptive behavior. So recently we've been trying to take this kind of set of tools that we've developed to study attentional orienting in working memory to study attentional orienting in long-term memory. Now, all of us pretty much know that when you retrieve something from long-term memory, you could think of that as an act of selective attention. So if I ask you about like, who did you have lunch with today, or what did you have for lunch, you can pick out that content from that episode from boundless of other experiences. And that is an act of being able to prioritize, select, and prepare those things to guide adaptive behavior. But in my humble opinion, I think we're still lacking really, really good experimental frameworks to study how does this happen? How does that process of prioritization of contents within long-term memory happen? So we've been trying to use the experience that we've gained to sort of look at these questions. So we have a bunch of studies that are ongoing, so none of them are actually completely complete. So the most complete one is something we started just before the pandemic. So we did some behavioral studies in person, and then we did a bunch of behavioral studies online. And now we're doing a bunch of imaging studies to follow up on this. So in these, what we've done is we've given people scenes, and we've associated with a bunch like 50 or 100 unique scenes. And with each scene, we associate 2 unique objects, and we get people to learn this over multiple blocks. So we show them a scene with 2 items, and then we say, which one was here? They're like, oh yeah, ducky. Okay, place the ducky, and then they'll click on the ducky place. So which one was here? Oh, the ball, where's the ball? They click on it, and they just do this to learn about these items. In this case, we did like 3 blocks, and people get, more accurate, faster, and better at localizing these things over blocks. So now we've loaded them up with a bunch of memories. Each scene has 2 competing things in it, and then we can kind of try to do retro cueing tasks with these long-term memory associations. So we show them the scenes, but now they don't have any of the objects in them, and then we can give them spatial cues. We can also give them animate or inanimate cues. It also works. And then we just ask them, for example, was this object in this scene, yes or no? So they're searching for this object in that scene, and basically we started off quite timid because we thought, oh, it might take quite a while for these cues to work, so we gave long delays of 750 milliseconds, and then as we became more confident that these things worked really well, we also did things super fast, so like with 150 millisecond delay, which is much faster than the usual super deliberative kind of processing. And we see that even with these very fast cues, with spatial or object-based cues, we get very consistent pattern of accuracy and reaction time benefits for cued, if you can orient your attention in long-term memory or not, which makes sense. But now we have a framework in which we can start studying how does it work. So now Bo Cheng Kuo, who was a visitor to the lab in many different versions. The last time he was visiting us, now he's a professor in his own lab. He came and he ran this study in the lab. So we did an EEG study and also an MR study with these kinds of tasks. And so we can see that like retro cues compared to the neutral cues start showing effects really early on. About 200 milliseconds, you start seeing some of these effects. Actually, it kicks off faster than if you do this kind of the same task with working memory arrays, which is really interesting and has theoretical implications. And we can also see in the case of long-term memories that you can start modulating the pickup of perceptual things in visual areas as well. So this is all to do at the moment. We're just like immersed analyzing MR and EEG and doing all of this stuff. But just to say, this is kind of the first steps to looking at this next arrow of the internal attention saga. But the thing that we're spending most of our time now is in this really interesting part of the diagram, which is here. Which is, now we have, very gratifying to me, despite all the debunkers and stuff, we actually have a field of internal attention. We're starting to shift that into long-term memory, and it's kind of riding as a baby sister alongside the big sister field of external attention. But we do not live in an external or an internal attention mode. So anything we do, even when we're engaged with the world, I'm focusing on contents coming out from the world to me, from the sensory stream, in my thoughts, in my memories, in order to do something. So it's this back and forth that happens all the time, which the brain is doing constantly and seamlessly, which is how do we move between memories and sensory objects. So that's where what we're working on at the moment. So it's really easy to see this kind of back and forth between sensory and selecting sensory versus working memory things. As soon as you take people out of being in front of a static computer and you just put them doing any kind of normal, immersive kind of task. So here is a task that, that Dejan Draškov, who was a postdoc in the lab and now has a faculty position at Oxford and is just starting his own lab there. So Dejan took some tasks based on some classic tasks by Mary Hayhoe and Ballard and stuff, where it's a quintessential working memory task. You have a model, like an arrangement of things, and then you basically have to pick up stuff and pick up some things and then make the same arrangement. So just basically copy what you see. It's just a typical working memory task. And if you think this is weird, I mean, we actually do this kind of stuff all the time. This is the IKEA version of it. You look at the model, you go pick up the stuff, you try to build the same model. Same thing with recipes and things, that we're kind of going back and forth. So this is the task, and so Dejan did this with virtual reality, and we could record where people are looking as they're doing the task and see whether they have to rely on looking for stuff from sensory display or whether they can use what's in their working memory in order to perform this task. So hopefully this video will work. Sound did work before, but it's not. So
first, objects needed to be encoded. Second, the current object was found and picked up. Before placing that object, we could measure if participants looked at the model again instead of relying on the initially encoded information.
Okay, so hopefully that was clear. So that we can measure where people are looking, and we can basically calculate how many attributes they're using. We don't know what's in their mind. They could maybe have everything in their mind, but we can tell what they're using in order to complete the task. So if they pick up one object but then look again, that means all they have is the identity, but they're not using the location. So they check the location, so that's one attribute. If they get the object and place it, then we know that they've used the whole object, the identity, and the location, 2 attributes, and so on. So if we were to estimate how people should do on this task, if we rely on all of our working memory studies in laboratories, we would say, people are going to pick up 3 full objects, or 4 maybe, and place them and be able to do that, because that's kind of the estimates of our working memory capacity, even though there's a lot of debate about exactly what makes those capacity limits and how they're shared, et cetera. But everyone agrees that you should be able to do a few things. What people do instead is not that at all. They actually sort of use one attribute most of the time. They pick up the thing, they check again. So more than half the time, they're only using one attribute in memory. If you make the task really hard, so we had different conditions where the model was in a different arrangement, so that you actually, in order to get the resources, you had to move around and then come back. Then rather than using, 60% at one attribute, maybe they sort of, instead of using one attribute, and so we can calculate, like here's like on average like 1.3. So rather than 1.3, they use 1.45. They still really lousy at using their working memory. So this just shows that in real world, the sensory world is here, and we go back and forth between selecting things in mind and selecting things in the world, and in order to guide our behavior. So one of the things that Dayan is continuing to do, and we're continuing to collaborate on this work also with our student Levi Kumle, who's still at Oxford, is now trying to study how we select from the sensory stream and from memories in these immersive situations, and basically what is this decision point when you choose whether you're going to rely on sensory stream or memory? So they're calling it like sensory mnemonic decisions, which is, these are self-guided decisions that we're making all the time. And we can manipulate lots of different aspects of this immersive task condition. So this is an example of a study where Levi was manipulating the amount of experience that you have with particular arrays. So in the previous study that I showed you, every array was unique. But in this case, they actually had people come in, and for the first session, they only ever copied 8 arrays. So they copy these 8 arrays in a randomized order, but they're learning about these, the brain could be learning about these 8 arrays. And, to encourage memory, but in a very mysterious way, they didn't tell the participants about this, which is a bit funky, I think. There was like, for every array, there was a unique scene associated with it. So that was kind of a memory prompt that people could use if they spontaneously chose to. So they would do these arrays, these 8 arrays, 8 times in one session, and then we would bring them back the next day, and they did those same 8 arrays and 8 new arrays. And they showed that as these arrays are repeated, people are actually relying on more attributes from their mind. So they start relying on their memories more. Still not a ton, but they rely more on their memories. They look less at the model. And then on the next day, if they're comparing how you're doing with an array with which you have an experience or not, you can see these advantages. People are using their memories more, and they're faster. And in some cases, so like the first time you interact with an array, you actually look at all the objects that you're eventually going to copy successfully. But if you're experienced with the array, in some cases, you never look at the object at all. You just completely rely on memory in order to perform on the task. So again, maybe nothing super earth-shattering, but a framework that enables us to start really looking at how long-term memories, working memories, sensory stream are all playing out as we're kind of trying to go about our actions. And Dayan and Levi are playing around now, starting to integrate. So they've done beautiful work looking at eye tracking, also head tracking. You can also track all different kinds of motion capture, but they're also moving to some of the neural measures in these immersive contexts as well. So the last kind of little chunk that I'm going to tell you about is something that I'm quite fascinated about, which is like, what happens at this moment when the brain shifts from selecting something from the sensory stream to something in working memory? So I've shown you there's kind of overlapping but not identical networks that control the guidance of external and internal attention. So what happens, like, if you're going in between? Do you have to bring in more players, the controller of the controllers? Is there like a superordinate control function? Or is there just a natural back and forth battle competition between these different modes that somehow gets resolved without any additional measurements? So here's kind of an example of like the everyday kind of simple situation. So this was me at a recent hotel room. So here was a very funky hotel room, very nouveau something. So this was my bedside table. I had some water and a old-fashioned clock, phone and stuff. And I turn away to look at the coffee machine. Now this whole thing is just in my memory now. I'm like, oh, coffee machine. So I immediately think back for the water location, to make my coffee and just go about the day. This is the kind of shift that we're kind of interested in. So Dani Gresh in my lab show, Dani was a graduate student at Oxford, and she crossed the Atlantic to join as a postdoc last year. She's been taking a lead in all these studies. So, we have a bunch of studies that look at how we orient attention to the sensory world within our minds. And so Dani has developed a way to study, like, how do we actually go in between these two tasks? And these are the usual. Now we're back to the lab with some very stilted experiments that hopefully will then go immersive at some point when we feel ready to tackle this. So it's the usual sort of set of oriented bars that we use. And so people, in any given trial, they see 4 placeholders of different colors. These change on a trial-by-trial basis. And then they get 2 items, which they encode. They're in working memory. Toward the end of the trial, they get the 2 other items. They get masked very quickly, and they have to report one of them. And so in between, we guide attention either to the array that is in working memory or the array that they're going to see perceptually. And in this task, the really important thing, so we have 2 cues. So we first shift attention to one location. Let's see, we do blue. If we orient to blue, it says, okay, this is to the future because the blue isn't filled yet. So you're orienting to the future. And then the second one is pink, like, oh no, pink, that was in the past. So you go first to the future and then to the past, or you can go to one location in memory and another location in memory, or one location in the sensory, another location in sensory. So we do the whole 2 by 2. But the really important thing, and they have to report the last one they were cued. So the really important thing is we need to make sure that people use the first cue, because otherwise we don't know that they've been shifting attention. They're just using the second cue. So we've done this in a bunch of different ways. In this particular version here, that I'm showing is like the first cue is 70% predictive. So people know that that cue is really useful and they use this cue. And then actually we throw out all that 70%. It's heartbreaking. You throw out all your data and then you focus on these 30% where you're shifting within or between the 2 domains. We design these behavioral tasks so that as soon as people are shifting to the second one, we then we want to catch the cost of shifting in action. So like we don't give much time for people to, use the cues and stuff. So we just ask them right away. And what we see is that there are indeed costs, behavioral costs. It takes you longer to shift to spatial locations if they're between the 2 domains than if they're within the 2 domains. And in this case, we have these reaction time costs. We also have some accuracy costs. Now, you may wonder, like, okay, how do these costs come about? Maybe this suggests that there's some kind of extra step that you have to go through. Maybe you have to, once you're about to cross domains, the brain says, wait, you're crossing domains. We're not ready. We need to build a bridge or switch where you are or put you through a portal. So you might have a rite of passage from one domain to the other. And indeed, some early studies had suggested that that might be a mechanism that would be this case. So here, we can use, first of all, our friendly eye movement proxies again. We can look at whether the internal or external attention shifts as proxied by these tiny movements of the eyes, if they're delayed when you have to cross between domain or not. That would suggest that you have to do something before you're allowed to orient attention spatially to the other domain. So we had some eye movement recordings in this task, and the answer is that doesn't happen at all. So actually the spatial shifts of attention, whether you're going from one domain to the other or whether you're in the same domain, are equally fast to develop. And that was really mysterious. So then we think, okay, I'll show you some more data. Then we can think about what does it mean. So then the other study that Dani has run is an MEG version of the study. So it's basically the same as what I told you before, but in this case, rather than using 70% stay cues, we have 50% of trials where there is only one cue. So you have to use that first cue, and again, we throw all those trials out, and then we focus in on those remaining 50% where people are shifting spatial attention either within or between domains. And here, because we're using MEG, we have longer pauses, including after. And even though you have a long pause and you have time to shift attention, you still see these small but significant residual costs behaviorally when you're shifting between versus within domain. But then we can record the MEG signal also and figure out what's going on, or get a glimmer of what's going on. So here's a plot that shows decoding when the second cue is either shifting you between or within domain. So there are a couple of nice things about here. First of all, it shows that at the time of the first cue, there's no way you could ever know that. The brain doesn't know that. So this shows that we don't have any contamination in our findings. But at the time of the second cue, the brain knows whether that cue is shifting you to the same domain or to a different domain. So something is going on. We can look at the spread of activity over the head, and what we see that it's basically pretty much all over the place. And we can look at a cross-temporal generalization function, and we can see that this is a highly dynamic process. So everybody here was like, oh, are you guys gonna go into source space and stuff? We're like, no, this is not the right method for this question. So actually, Danny has just finished collecting, a massive data set of people doing this in the MR to see whether we have new players on the block or whether we have the two usual control systems just battling it out. But what we can say here is that it's not like something is happening very quickly and very dynamically in the brain. So, I think it's going to turn out to be quite an interesting answer. And then once we have that, we'll go back into the MEGS data and try to see if we can link these dynamics to the spatial networks. But here again, we can look at the same proxy that we have looked at before, which is this idea of like looking at the spatial shifts. So we can use alpha again. And again, in this task, we also have these tiny eye movements. We co-vary them out. We show that we can't, we can throw all of any contamination from those eye movements away, and then we can look at over and above neural activity related to spatial shifts when you're within domain or between domain. And basically, you can see that first you shift attention to one side, and then you shift to the other. So that's why the alpha goes, red and blue, depending. But if you look at the modulation times, you can see that the timing is basically the same, whether you're shifting within or between domain. And here they are, the alpha things overlapping on each other. So it seems that there is no extra step that you have to go through. There's no sort of domain police that says, wait, now you are crossing domains. But there is something still happening. Either it's a competitive process or some control function that's happening at some different stage. So this is where we are. So at the moment, we've ruled out sort of like the most obvious explanation, that there isn't like a controller at this disengage and jump phase. But there may be extra areas involved in like trying to link whatever contents are to guide action, for example, or disambiguate the actions depending on the domain. So there may be other control functions that may elaborate, or we might just see the battle between the external sensory stream and our internal contents already in our mind. So to summarize this part, we're really into this new phase of the work, trying to understand this back and forth between sensation, working memory, but also long-term memory. So we also have studies that are looking at how the interplay among these three different kinds of signals. And we're developing a bunch of new experimental frameworks. So I showed you some of the immersive VR stuff, the cueing stuff, behaviorally, but we're also developing different kinds of search tasks and stuff. So just to make sure that whatever we find is not going to be locked to a very specific type of experimental approach. We have some early clues, but we've got a ton of work ahead of us, which is quite fun. So just to wrap up, we've covered quite a big arc today. Thanks for bearing with me. So we talked about the heretical focus in working memory, how we're starting to stretch that into the long-term memory domain, and now looking at the back and forth between all of these different kinds of signals. Thank you.
We'd like to open it now for questions. I think we have runners who will help us bring the mics around. So maybe Darko.
Thanks. I have two questions if I can, but if we don't have time, you can just handle whichever one you think is more interesting. The first is a little technical, and that is about the long-term memory. how do we differentiate between the possibility that this is internal attention going back to long-term memory, as opposed to long-term memory getting dumped into working memory and internal attention operating there?
Great question.
Yeah,
Can I answer that?
please.
So, one, we don't know, but two, we can find out. So I think so I didn't show you, but we have like a parallel version of that task where we also have the working memory version of it. So we can compare the processes in the two cases. But I would say, it's quite interesting actually, that most people kind of have this implicit model that long-term memory comes into working memory, and then, goes back to the Atkinson and Schifrin model, et cetera. But there is a possibility that stuff also comes from long-term memory directly. And so I think if you read the long-term memory retrieval literature, they talk about attention and long-term memory is happening, but they never really spend a lot of time talking about the mediation of that through working memory. So I think that is an old question that is wide open. So we have a paper that actually has just been published, last week, using more of these kind of simple objects. And so we have colored objects that are blobby shaped, and people have to reproduce the shape. And they learn two locations of two blobby shapes, and they learn them in long-term memory. And then the next session, and sometimes the next day, we have, those guys are in two placeholders. We have an array where we show two other things. Then they go away. So the new ones are now in working memory. The old ones are never shown again, so they're in long-term memory. And then we give them a cue. It says, I'm likely to ask you about the green one, something. That could be either in long-term memory or working memory. If it's in working memory, you get the microsaccades. If it's in long-term memory, nothing. Totally different. So that suggests to us that at least in some tasks, you can have a really different mechanism for orienting attention in long-term memory than working memory. Now, that's a very particular task. Maybe they were overlearned on those blobby locations. But to us, that just shows that this really old question that we all think we have the answer to, wide open.
Awesome, thanks. The other question is about, I was expecting you to maybe talk a little bit about the maybe competition between internal and external memory, attention. Can we think about things like, pop-out effects in internal memory, like ruminating thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and things like that? Like, is it worthwhile thinking about notions like of attentional capture in the internal system in maybe something like rumination, for example?
Yeah, I think what we're doing, I think a lot of these concepts are discussed in rumination. Sometimes people talk about maybe focusing people away from negative things and stuff. But I think these frameworks are a little simplified, but I think they will give us a more controlled leverage into those big questions. But I think that ultimately all those are the interesting questions. I think what we're doing is the bare bones to enable us to ask those more sophisticated questions a little bit better. And this idea of there's some notions now, this is what we actually really, really wanted to do initially, and we have never really thought about the perfect way to do it. And I call this the looking for love experiment, which is this, I'll never be able to explain why that I wanted to call it that. But this idea that, do these two types of representations constantly coexist, and we can kind of play around in each of them, or are they kind of ebbing and flowing? So there are some studies now. So I think Ian Feeblecorn, actually based on some of our stuff, is now seeing whether you have these kind of behavioral shifts in an oscillatory way for external and internal contents, and do they go together or do they go the opposite way? So I think this is super interesting, and so we wanted to do a study like that with dense sampling, but we could never come up with the right task because we wanted to use motion moving task. We wanted the internal representation to be on equal par as the external one. So that was the looking for love, this idea you have a song or something, and at some point you have a word, and it might have happened before, or it might happen next, so you don't really know, so you're looking for things back and forth. So those are some of the search things that we're trying to do. And we hope to do some dense sampling to understand, like, do these things coexist? Do they compete all the time? Are they running at different frequencies? We have no idea. So
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great talk, very interesting. I remember a few years back, I was reading this book by David Badre called On Task, How the Brain Gets Things Done. And it's fascinating, like, the processes that are involved. So making coffee, for example, that you need to know where it's spatial, you need spatial memory, and again, temporal, because you need to get the order right, otherwise you don't have coffee. And but what would happen when there's the unexpected, like the jolt we get when we do everything, but we don't have filters anymore? So does that, like, do we tap into a different way of thinking? Does it maybe creativity? Is it intuition? How do we solve that issue that was unexpected?
yeah, okay. So I guess similar to my answer before, like, I think what we're doing is kind of the bare bones to get to some of those interesting questions. One of the things that actually Danny, who's done this cueing stuff, internal and external, she's also done some interesting studies showing, like, what happens, like, let's say you're holding something in mind, you have to be on task, and then something happens, and sometimes you actually have to mom calls, you have to go, stop, mom, you have to interact with that phone, or sometimes you can just ignore it. So she's actually done some studies. She's shown that if your interruption is temporally expected, actually what happens is, like, you are able to shield the contents of working memory and to perform better on the task externally. So sometimes by having sort of temporal, if you have a temporal foreknowledge, you can both protect memories and interact with the world better. And then she's also done these studies now with when you're interrupted and you have to bring back the working memory task. So she shows that she can track the time course of how you can reboot both the sensory and the motor plans immediately after you're done with the interruption. So at least we're studying how the external and the internal things are, like, competing when one is disrupting the other. But the more interesting question is, like, capture, how does something different, creativity. I think, hopefully those questions will be able to build on some of these simpler building blocks of using these, because by using working memory, you can control what are the mental representations that people have. If you start, allowing imagination and creativity, then it gets really hard to experiment with that. But we hope that this will be a footing for those questions.
Okay. Hi, thanks for the very inspiring talk. So I have two questions, actually. One is a little technical. So no difference between external and internal attention in MEG work that you presented in the last part of the talk. So do you expect that is because of the subcortical area that is mainly involved in that process? So is that why you are kind of, going forward the fMRI rather than source of reconstruction of the MEG signal?
Yeah, so we have two, I would say, not great proxies of the spatial shifts. One is the microsaccades, and then the other one is the modulation of these visual excitability by alpha. And in both of those cases, we see that the time course of shifting attention in space, the orienting functions, whether it's external or internal, they don't seem to be affected temporally. I'm not sure it's a lack of, like, the resolution of seeing things. It could be. Actually, the microsaccade effect is quite fast. Starts happening around 150 to 200 milliseconds. But the brain knows that if you're in a between or within state earlier than that. So there's stuff going on, but it's not really affecting the spatial shifts. But it could be affecting other things very early on. So my guess, and my guesses are always terrible on these things, I'm always wrong, but I think that it's actually trying to link the contents to your stuff, to guiding the action. I think that's where the competition is, because ultimately, you have a few effectors that you have to use. So I think actually sort of arbitrating between that might show some really early effects. We don't have any easy way to measure that in these tasks. But yeah, so, and actually going back to the Badri comment, so, we have now something like 48 data sets, people doing this thing twice and stuff. And some of the higher order prefrontal areas, like the 946, are like, we're checking in on that. We're starting to see some interesting things about, early days to see if, so, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the other one is more about the attention itself. So the first part of the talk, you talked about how internal attention can be used for selecting one of the 4 locations, right? So is it possible to think of anything that is not bound to spatial locations in terms of internal selection? So is it almost infeasible or maybe impossible because your actions and motor control is always inseparable from space? So is it anything more like external feature-based attention in the domain of internal attention?
Yeah, okay. Yes, so I basically, I showed all the spatial stuff because of, I wanted to tell you about lots of different things, but we've done non-spatial feature-based attention in working memory. We've done feature dimension, so all of that works. You can select pure features with location uncertainty. You can prioritize color versus shape. So all of these non-spatial things, as we have in external attention, also work in internal attention. I love questions I can answer, actually. I usually get questions I can't answer.
Just to follow up, you mentioned all these features in addition to orientation. Is it all within the visual domain? Or have you done, because I think about when we're testing working memory, for example, in neuropsychological tests, we're often doing verbal working memory as well as visual and visual spatial. And I'm curious if you think they would be calling upon different resources or if it's a more domain general kind of working memory.
Yeah, so to my shame, most of the stuff we've done is primarily visual. And actually, even when we're doing the temporal stuff where, vision is not the right, modality to work on, we've done a few other things in audition. We haven't done the internal attention and working memory, but other people have done it. So people have done this with auditory stimuli, also works. They have done it with tactile, also works. So yeah, it's, I'm not sure the extent to which people have looked at what are the common versus distinguishing mechanisms within that, but I think there is a domain general kind of network, but I think there may also be, in some cases, some particular modality-specific effects as well.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, so talking about the interplay between external and internal attention, it reminds me a lot about, for example, your example about making coffee. And it reminds me of people with like maybe ADHD that kind of maybe have issues with completing chores. I seem to remember that in some interview guides for diagnosing ADHD, they talk about a lot about like not completing chores. So that makes me wonder what like some of the implications for the interplay between external and internal attention would be, kind of taking into account how ADHD people kind of deal with this compared to neurotypical people. And I was wondering if there's any specific data that you would have encountered when you did these experiments.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's a fantastic question. And to be honest, there's like almost zero work looking at, I consider these things as, maybe they haven't been studied very much in this kind of very controlled way before, but these are really fundamental processes. Like the brain is organizing the pickup of sensory versus memory stuff all the time. The brain is focusing on internal contents all the time. In my task, they're just focusing on boring things, but in interesting tasks, they're focusing on, their fears or their hopes, really important things. And, I think these are very ripe functions that we should examine to understand, are people getting stuck on certain things? Are they unable to recover when there's a distraction? I think these things are just completely unexplored at the moment, but I think there's an enormous potential for doing that work.
Thank you.
Hi. So a lot of the experiments has been done with the visual part of the human mind. So I was wondering, like, what about people with aphantasia, who apparently can't exactly form like images in their mind? And for people, well, neurotypical people, I suppose, but when we say we recall memory, it's usually some kind of image that we kind of like get back in our mind. But what about people that apparently cannot exactly do something like that?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. When we started doing the retrocueing stuff, I think when those studies were unusual for people, now they're so usual, people forget that they're interesting. They just like, oh, retrocueing, how are they working? But we had a lot of people asking us about imagery. We used to have like imagery questionnaires, but I think we had some not very informative questionnaires, and we actually saw that the performance wasn't very correlated with imagery. Actually, Mark Stokes did do some multivariate sort of imagery things with aphantasia, but not with the retrocueing. I know that someone was doing that, but I have never seen a completed study. So I think the whole, again, this is, I think, really interesting and emblematic of how really interrelated literatures and fields kind of go side by side. So the imagery and the working memory field, they kind of completely separate, but there is deep connection between them. My guess is that in a lot of these tasks, especially in very fast, you can do them as a zombie. You don't have to have any, rich internal imagery to actually perform in these tasks. So I think the extent to which you actually really need that qualitative experience, reflective, to do the task is still a really big open question. So yeah, if you have a group of aphantasia people, I'm happy to send the task, and you can. I think that'd be super interesting. Yeah.
Hi, my question, I guess, is a little bit along the same lines of the previous two, so I apologize if I'm getting into speculative territory, but I had a really visceral reaction to, I'm going to call the IKEA task or the VR that you showed, in terms of if participants were constantly looking to see that external stimuli, because personally I would be doing that. I love to check to make sure what I'm doing is right. But it kind of unlocked a new dimension of skill that I hadn't thought about before. So for example, if you have two artists who are both, let's say, similar in talent, but one really needs a reference versus the other artist is really great at drawing things they saw months ago. I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit more about this as a dimension of learning or skill.
Yeah, so Dayan, alongside collecting data for all these various, so we didn't do that for the first study, but since the second study, they've also been collecting a lot of individual difference measures on people to start looking at, because people should be able not to look at those things, but they're, for some reason, the world's there, they check. So we played around a little bit, like we had a version where all of a sudden the model would just disappear. So you had to do as many things as you could to, and people are a little bit better, but I think they weren't expecting it, so they were still pretty bad. And once they start expecting it, then they start doing the task in a completely different way. But I think, again, like the answer to the other ones, I think we now have a footing to ask these questions, to ask about how does this really link to different personality traits. And there may also be interesting measures in how people look back at things, not just that they look back, but you might actually see signatures of memory just in the patterns at which they look back. So I think it's a super rich, we used to have to do these tasks to be controlled in these like very artificial settings, but now we can measure amazing things with, kind of modest immersion, but, we can just take it to the next level. So yeah, don't have an answer, but I think that would be fascinating. And also expertise, as you mentioned, like people who actually are comfortable with their inner, imagery and able to work with that. I think that'd be really fascinating.
Thank you.
Well, now we're getting into the clear domain of questions I cannot answer, which is fine.
Hi, following up on the previous question, I think we all here were surprised that it's just like basically one item and one feature at a time. I sort of expected more of people's working memory, but I'm just wondering, first of all,
Yeah?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So it was in virtual reality.
Yeah.
And this is an environment that is a bit unsure, like this hand that was picking up. I mean, I'm sure the participants had the training, but basically what I'm driving at, did you ever think about trying it with physical environment or creating conditions that make checking back and forth more effortful, right?
Yeah.
So encouraging greater use of working memory.
Yeah. So, okay, first I want to make one comment, which is you are expecting more of people. So I also, I know where you're coming from, but there is another spin of that, which is like the brain is the most amazing organ. It doesn't waste energy on doing anything it doesn't have to do. So if the world is there, like why actually use a bunch of stuff, just check, like, so there's a positive spin to like how frugal the brain is. And my experience is if like the brain doesn't have to do something in a task, it won't do it. That's kind of, it's like it's super lazy, which is a good thing. You want your brain to be lazy, so it doesn't have to clear out all those toxins and stuff later on. So that's one thing. The other point is, we're doing this in VR. So in VR, so Dayan, I showed you the one task where we have as people get more experience with those particular objects, they do a little bit better. We also, Levi has another task where they made it more difficult for people to find the objects that they have to put in. So there's also interference there. So we have like low interference and high interference. And they can show exactly in which way does sensory interference interact with this. So it's all as a tool for starting to dissect all these things that happen all the time out. In the initial study, we did have a condition where, it was either very easy or people had to go. And then they use more working memory, but still very little. But then what we're doing now, well, not now yet, because it's in July, we will have an immersive cave set up at Yale, so that rather than actually doing this with VR, we can actually control, like in a 360-degree cinema kind of situation that's interactive with where people are looking. So we can actually change it so that we don't have to have goggles and we can kind of project the world. So we can also do things in that way. And, I'm sure we'll replicate the findings. I don't think it's going to be I think there are some things that really different in VR from the real world. There's like some amazing work by Mayank Mehta in rodents showing that all the place cells and things completely disappear when, in certain VR situations where you decouple sort of sensory domains from each other, but I don't think that's going to happen here, but I could be wrong.
Thank you, Kia, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, when do you draw the line between internal attention and thinking?
I don't. I just do boring internal attention, and then, I think this is, we want, so we're doing internal attention with working memory, but then, we want to do thinking, we want to do planning, we want to, we want to move, but we just do one thing at a time. But, Oh, and then the other thing I always forget to say is like, of course, everything is internal, right? So like everything is happening in our brains, but it's like, I use external as just like this shorthand for things that are coming out from the sensory stream, but it's still happening internally in the brain. I think it's time for a drink.
I think so. Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's time. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. That's so fascinating. But we can continue the conversation downstairs, where we'll get a little bit more. But before that,
Oh, wow.
We have a bit of a gift that we would like to present you with. I'm going to hand it off to you so you can provide Kia with this. But I want to thank you so much.
I think this was the best. I had such a great time. Thank you, everyone.
Well, this is the external gift, and this is
Excellent.
the one that you can remember internally.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been a really wonderful afternoon for me and whole day, actually. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, please do join us for a drink.
Wow, I didn't expect a gift.